It took years for Bashar al-Assad's forces to take back Syria's second city. It took just days for jihadist-led rebels to overrun Aleppo. Why is a conflict that's been effectively frozen for the past 4 years suddenly sprung back to life? What to make of Hezbollah, pinned down at home by a precarious truce with Israel, saying it won't be sending help for now? What role for Assad backers Russia and Iran? And what role for Turkey, which backs some of the rebel groups with an eye to pushing Syrian Kurdish forces away from its border? Recep Tayyip Erdogan last summer had offered a deal with Damascus, which Assad turned down on the grounds that it would mean ceding nominal sovereignty over the territory he has never really recaptured in parts of the north these last 11 years. Back then, it was the Arab Spring and the leader of a hereditary dynasty who looked ripe for the falling. Assad, after 2013, proved predictions wrong. Could it be different this time? If so, how? Today in the France 24 debate, is Syria suddenly feeling the domino effect of a Middle Eastern turmoil? With us, Ariad Hanem, Franco-Syrian lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks as well to Samir Aita, president of the Paris-based Circle of Arab Economists. Good to see you.
Hello. Good to see you too.
From Washington, Gönül Tol, director of the Middle East Institute think tank's Turkish program, the author of Erdogan's War, A Strong Man's Struggle, at home and in Syria. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And we welcome back from Norman, Oklahoma, Joshua Landis, director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. How are you, Joshua?
Pleasure being with you.
In ever greater numbers, you've been listening, liking, and subscribing to the France 24 debate. That's wherever podcasts are streamed. After Aleppo, the rebels pushing into the central Hama province, there have been cries of victory over the past days, but also a growing death toll, and at least 50,000 displaced. Solange Mougin has more.
Filming in and staking their ground in this palace is a prize in and of itself for these insurgent fighters, for it had been one of President Bashar al-Assad's residences. The symbolic seizing was part of a lightning-fast storming of Aleppo, which began November 27th. It was, for the coalition of groups, the biggest success against the Assad regime in years. Clashes between a constellation of insurgents and Assad's troops and his allies have now broken out across the war-torn nation, killing hundreds. It has also upped the ante among different foreign powers involved in Syria. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, Iran-backed Iraqi soldiers have been crossing into Syria to support al-Assad troops, and Russian jets have been bombing the insurgent positions in the northwest, like in Idlib. For civilians, full-on war is back in their lives, in a conflict that began in 2011 with al-Assad's crackdown on democracy protests, but which had been largely frozen since 2020.
We woke up to the sounds of terror, fear, and airstrikes. I can't describe the horror we witnessed and what we felt. We live in a camp that's next to a family that was hit.
The UN says they are alarmed by the escalation of the sudden violence, which has in less than a week displaced nearly 50,000 people. More than half of them are children.
Syrians have endured the conflict for nearly 14 years. They deserve a political horizon that will deliver a peaceful future, not more bloodshed.
With violent clashes continuing in places like Idlib, Hama, and Deir al-Zor, but also elsewhere across Syria, the UN's Human Rights Office says that civilians are being killed in the crossfire, adding to an already dire humanitarian situation, where nearly 17 million people in Syria depend daily on humanitarian aid.
A death toll revised upwards, according to humanitarian aid agencies, more than 600 killed in the past week. Samir Aita, were you surprised?
I'm surprised that nobody noticed that there was a buildup of military power in the front of al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda guys, HTS, whatever you call it. And this has been built up for a year. I'm surprised that Golani the Jolani, the head of this thing, declared that he will take Aleppo. Nobody reacted. Both sides, means Western side and Bashar, Iranian side. I'm surprised with the timing. Just after the ceasefire in Lebanon and just after that, Netanyahu threatened Bashar al-Assad that he is playing with fire. What does that mean? And I'm surprised with the collapse. So I'm like everybody. I'm surprised. And I'm surprised, just one sentence.
Sure.
I'm surprised especially with the people who took the decision to make this, because this will bring Syria to the war again.
There'll be a second bloody battle of Aleppo.
In my humble opinion, I think this resembles to the people who make the decision to make the 7th October and didn't calculate how much the change and the bloodshed will be that will come afterwards. I don't know if they really realized what they are done. Today we are talking that Syria will maybe invite Iranian troops, not Iraqi militias, but Iranian troops to enter Syria.
And the Iranians are considering it. We'll look at international reactions in a moment. Ahyad Hanem, a lot to unpack in what Samir said. The regime caught off guard, as well as the international community, by what happened, by the build-up to it, and the sudden swoop where they took Aleppo with seeming ease. And the timing of it. What do you make of the timing of it?
Yeah, exactly. I share the same opinion as
How do you explain it?
I think it's very hard to explain it, but one can identify the conditions of possibility of it. That's interesting to see the evolutions of the situation in the past months. Of course, the evolution of Syria's longtime partners, the Hezbollah, which is very occupied with the situation in Lebanon. Even if we have this very precarious ceasefire and truce that you mentioned, Iran, of course, that is also facing a lot of challenges, both regionally and internally. Russia, of course, with the situation in Ukraine. And also the internal dimensions, what makes the Syrian regime, what has made the success of the Syrian regime in its authoritarian resilience in the last 10 or 12 years. These partners, but also internal supports, parts of the state, minorities, urban elites. This has also been weakened in the last months. So it's not surprising that this would happen when one considers the weakness of the regime. But I was also shocked by how speed it went, how fast it was.
Because we oscillated, right? Back in 2013, we oscillated between, the Assad regime is invincible, to saying, it's a house of cards, to saying it's invincible again.
Yeah, again, I think that there are two most important aspects to what we call the authoritarian resilience of Bashar al-Assad in the past 12 years. He had the support of the minorities. You have minorities in Syria, the Alawites, on the coastal part of Syria mostly, cities like Latakia, Tartus. He had some parts of the Syrian bourgeoisie also for a long time. And he had these partners, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah.
And the Christians.
And the Christians, of course, among the minorities. When I went to Syria a year ago, I went to Latakia, I was surprised by how weaker and weaker the support of minorities, and first of all, the Alawites was going. Because they had to pay a very high price to this war. They had to send a lot of youths to this war, tens of thousands of them dying in this war. When you walk today in a city like Latakia, you see a lot of what we call nawat in Arabic. These are the little papers talking about the martyrs, so the young people who died in the war. You see dozens of them in the streets. So a very high price. And I was very surprised by some of the discussion that I had with people in Latakia, some of them who were former officers of the army, saying the Assad regime won the war, we did not. And if it was to happen again, we would not follow. So that's also a very interesting evolution.
Joshua Landis, let me ask you, because you heard Samir Aita's concern at the beginning that this will once again end in mass bloodshed. But there, you just heard there from Ariad, based on what he saw last year inside of Syria, that there's a war weariness. Which will it be in the face of this huge surprise?
I think he's absolutely right. The regime supporters who fought this war are exhausted, and they were expecting a peace dividend after the frozen conflict, after the war petered out. They wanted the economy to come back, jobs, electricity, state resources. None of that happened. In fact, just the opposite. The Syrian economy has been shrinking year after year. If you're a young Syrian today, you see a very bleak future in front of you with Assad in power. American sanctions are crushing. America's taken most of the gas and oil for the Kurdish rebels who they're allied with. And the regime is broken, and the spirit has gone out of this army quite clearly. They do not want to die for this regime. And that ultimately we'll have to see whether the regime can rally its troops. But I've got to say that Jolani has been extraordinarily resourceful. He's changed over the last 5 years, and in particular, he has gone after the Christians in a way to reassure the Christians and reassure the other minorities, not so much the Alawites, but the Christians, the Druze, the others, that he's not going to, and his men are not going to hurt them. So he's splitting Assad's minoritarian support, his minorities, and has been very resourceful in his ability to win Western support, get Turkish support, and to rebuild his military when Assad has not.
Yeah, and that broaches the question that the next question, which is exactly what is this rebel-led alliance? Under a 2019 agreement that you allude to, Joshua, the rebels had been essentially parked in Idlib province. Now it's that offshoot of al-Qaeda, now known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, that's leading the alliance. Karis Garland has more.
Hayat Tahrir al-Sham traces its beginnings to the Syrian civil war in 2011. However, the group was set up under a different name, Jabhat al-Nusra, as a direct affiliate of al-Qaeda.
It is led by Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, who was a former commander of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is essentially an offshoot of al-Qaeda.
During the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad, Jabhat al-Nusra proved to be one of the most dangerous opposition forces. However, it appeared to be motivated by jihadist ideology rather than the sake of the revolution. In 2016, the group broke ranks with al-Qaeda, with leader al-Jolani setting up a new organization that would later take the name Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It was part of a bid to portray the group as more moderate with local aims, though HTS is still designated a terrorist outfit by the UN and countries like the US and Turkey. It's the dominant force in Syria's northwestern province of Idlib, establishing itself as the de facto local administration in areas it controls. Those areas have recently expanded with the taking of Aleppo from forces loyal to Assad. HTS is working alongside other factions with the goal of establishing fundamentalist Islamic rule in Syria.
What we have is we have a coalition of groups, some of them secular, some of them Islamist, but all of them are united with this goal that almost 14 years after the Syrian uprising started, they still want to get rid of the Assad regime throughout all of the Syria, not just the northwest of the country.
While HTS has made efforts to project an image of legitimacy among local populations, that's been tainted by allegations of persistent human rights abuses.
And just to be clear on that point, the U.S. State Department emphasizing HTS did not overnight become good guys in the eyes of Washington.
Organization that launched this offensive over the weekend is a terrorist organization designated as such by the United States. We certainly do not support that organization in any way, shape, or form.
Gunnar Toll, the State Department spokesperson there, forced to say it because there's been all this speculation over whether or not this is somehow the hand of Washington and what has just transpired. Again, I hark back to what Samir said at the outset of this conversation, just how much of a surprise it all is.
That's right. And if you look at the White House statement right after the capture of Aleppo, it put all the blame on the Assad regime. So basically, I think President Assad managed to anger everyone, including the Russians, Iranians, and also the Americans. Because the goal here, if you look at it from the perspective of all these countries, including Turkey, Russia, and the Americans, they all want a negotiated solution. Russians, for example, have been trying to bring together the Kurds and the Assad regime and Turkey in an effort to end this war and make sure that the American imposed sanctions are lifted so Russia can focus its energies elsewhere in Ukraine. And Americans similarly have been trying to find a negotiated solution. Earlier this year, for example, Americans approached the Syrian Kurdish militia that they back, and also the Assad regime, because they were trying to bring those together to reach an agreement. President Erdogan, on his part, have been calling on Assad to normalize ties. And just recently, in the Saudi capital, the Saudi leader Mohammed bin Salman tried to bring Assad and President Erdogan together, and Assad basically rebuffed those efforts. So Assad finds himself in a place where his allies are weakened, they are distracted, and they are very angry at him. So in that regard, I think timing is not very surprising, especially from the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's point of view. This was the perfect moment, and right before President Trump returns to the White House.
Right before Trump returns to the White House. And your thought watching that report, Ghanul, about what HTS, how radical it is today, how much minorities should believe them, that they've moved on from their agenda for a more political one?
It's a great PR campaign by Jolani, and I agree with Josh. This all started after Jolani separated his own movement from Al-Qaeda in 2016. The goal there was to brand itself as a more moderate organization and prevent a Western attack on his organization. So that was the goal, and it evolved into an organization that pitched itself as an organization that can fight effectively against terrorist groups and that can govern. And if you look at its recent messaging, right after the capture of Aleppo, reaching out to Christians and also the Kurds, the Syrian Democratic Forces, telling that, Kurds are also part of Syrian society, so we are not going to attack you. If you look at that messaging and how Jolani focuses that HTS's main target is ISIS, I think that's a message to the West. Jolani telling the West that I can be partners, much like Taliban, how it's partnering with the US and also seen by countries like Russia as an effective force in fight against terrorism. So I think that's Jolani's strategy, but I don't think anyone is buying that in Western capitals.
Nobody's buying it in Western capitals, Samir Aita, but is there a new anti-Assad coalition in the West, or are people just watching this from the sidelines here?
It's far more than that. Let me start with some comments. First, Assad was a controversial president of Syria in 2011. He chose to be a warlord, like Jolani. He had occasion since the settlement that the Russians made with the Turks, with the Iranians, etc., and the calming down of the military situation, to make many initiatives to become back as a president for the Syrians first.
And he seemed to get that last year. You remember that Arab League summit where he's welcomed and Syria's back in the fold?
Not only that. I know many Syrian opponents.
Didn't it seem at the time that the page had been turned?
Yes, and I know many Syrian opponents since 3-4 years who settled their situation with the Syrian authorities, wanted to go back, and etc. So this was a measure. He was not capable of making a gesture. toward this. Also, he was not capable to make the gesture toward Erdogan. Everybody knows that Turkey has a great influence on northwest Syria. Imagine if he had met Erdogan, who will be the most embarrassed? Erdogan will be embarrassed because the official position of most of the Western country is Bashar is a bad guy. So he could get a win from this situation. And the problem is that everybody hides behind the idea of a political situation. The problem in Syria is that today the political opposition, whatever it is, has no power. Today, the guys who are the people to get a peace between are Jolani, Bashar al-Assad, and Maslum Abdi of the SDF. So is it possible to put these three guys on a table? Whatever is the reason, nobody listens to the provisional government who is in Gaziantep and Antab in southern Turkey.
It happens with the people who have the guns.
Jolani, with all his campaign and trying to be good with the Christians of Aleppo, with the Kurds and etc., has the problem of managing this with the rest of the Syrians, with the Alawis.
Or maybe it's down to Syria's rival patrons. Let's talk about Turkey. We've been mentioning it now. In a phone call with the Iraqi Prime Minister earlier, Recep Tayyip Erdogan stating that Syria's government needs to engage in a real political process to de-escalate events in its north. Erdogan, who stated that Ankara is, quote, taking steps to prevent the PKK terrorist organization and its extensions of taking advantage of developments. Turkey, which has one eye on Kurdish separatists near its border, the other on constituents at home in border areas who fear a fresh influx of Syrian refugees.
We don't want people to be displaced again. On the contrary, we want displaced people to return to their homes. It is very important that the inflow of refugees stops and reverses.
Gönül Tol, let me ask you, how much of this for Turkey is about regional influence, and how much of it is because they have disgruntled constituents in cities like the aforementioned Gaziantep?
The main, for Erdogan, whatever steps Turkey has taken so far in Syria, it always has a huge domestic angle. And today is not different. Turkey has two goals in Syria, as you mentioned. One is curbing Kurdish influence and making sure that the autonomous Kurdish region in northern Syria comes to an end. And the second goal Turkey has in Syria is to make sure that the refugees, 4 million refugees living in Turkey, can safely return back to their countries. So those two angles are primarily domestic. President Erdogan has been losing ground in the polls, and just this year he lost in local elections almost all major cities to the opposition. And one of the top reasons for declining support for Erdogan is the presence of Syrian refugees in Turkey. There's a huge nationalist backlash against it. So that's why Erdogan, before he faces another elections in 2028, he wants to make sure that he sends the Syrian refugees back to Syria. So that's a very much domestic goal. And the other goal is to make sure that Turkey ends the autonomous Kurdish region in northern Syria. And domestically, Erdogan has been seeking the pro-Kurdish parties' support in his efforts to be able to rerun in 2028 elections. So I think domestic drivers are the main drivers here, but the regional context, particularly following October 7th, post-October 7th developments, gave Erdogan an opening, and he sees the regional context as a window of opportunity. Because
he sees a window of opportunity, but let me ask you then, because it's a question on a lot of people's lips, does Turkey have a hand in this swoop for Aleppo? Was Turkey informed? Does it seem to you like the Turks knew what was about to happen?
Turkey gave the green light to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, allowed HTS to launch this incursion. But Turkish government officials, as well as Turkish armed forces, went out of their way to tell everyone that they did not have any direct impact on the operation, that they were not directly involved in the operation. And the fact that they are saying that makes a lot of sense. First, I think, yes, Turkish armed forces were not involved directly, but also Turkish government wants to signal to the regional countries, particularly the Gulf countries and the United States, that they are not pursuing the regime change approach that they had pursued right after following the Arab uprisings in 2010, because that policy, quote unquote, revolutionary policy, where Turkey wanted to topple the regional autocrats, cost Turkey a lot. And it took years for President Erdogan to mend ties with Gulf countries and countries like Egypt. So that's why Turkey does not want to be seen as the country that is pushing for regime change again. But Turkey certainly holds leverage over HDS. And when HTS tried to launch this incursion 7 weeks ago, Turkey put the brakes on that. But now, after several developments, basically allowed HTS to go ahead.
So let me ask you then, Hayat Hanem, is it just a case, like has been said by our panelists here, of getting Assad to compromise a little, as we say in French, putting water in your wine? Or is this about this isn't really about the likes of Recep Tayyip Erdogan or any other outside player?
Yeah, I think it's what we are witnessing now is a new phases of fragmentation of the Syrian territory, with a lot, of course, of international influences. You mentioned Turkey. I really agree with everything that was said earlier. For Turkey, the Syrian question is an internal one. It really divides the public opinion, the question of the Syrian refugees and how to send them back to Syria. You have, of course, Iran, you have, of course, Russia, and the Syrian regime is in the middle. And you have also the different pockets with other groups, the Kurds in the east, the Druze also in the south of the country. So I think that I have heard a lot of narratives going on about what is happening. Is it about putting pressure on Assad so that he has to step back, or is it something else? I think that what is happening is just the continuity of ongoing dynamics for years now, which is the fragmentation of the country, with different groups and different areas of control and influence that are becoming more and more impossible to conceal.
Joshua Landis, you agree?
You know, I think this is a legacy issue for Erdogan. When he started on this civil war, he wanted to win the whole enchilada. And he has had his ears pinned back because he couldn't do it. The rebels failed, and his detractors have been criticizing him for saying, you should get out of Syria. You shouldn't have done this. You made a mistake. I think this offers him an opportunity to do a number of things. If he can get to Damascus and get his rebels to Damascus,
all the way to Damascus.
He will have made an incredible, if he can bring down this regime and replace it with a Islamist government that is friendly to Turkey, a Sunni government, he will have done many different things. He will have broken the Shiite crescent that reaches from Hezbollah in Lebanon right to Iran, and he will have replaced the Alawite regime with a Sunni regime. He will be able to send back refugees if he can stop this war and win it. If it becomes a frozen war, there's going to be more refugees coming out. He could be a real winner here, just like Netanyahu, who was losing support and his government was weak. He won in Gaza. He smashed Hezbollah. He attacked Iran. He has turned himself into a conqueror. And I think Erdogan, who's getting old, like Netanyahu, would like to finish this thing with a big win and be able to tell his detractors, you are weak, you doubted me, and you are losers. I am the winner.
Okay, so Joshua, forget the readout from the call, but there was a telephone conversation earlier between Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Vladimir Putin. what do you think that the Turkish and Russian presidents said to each other?
Well, I think the Russians are saying, stop this. We need to save Assad and you need to stop the war and so forth. And I imagine that Erdogan probably said yes, yes, yes. But does he mean it? I think Erdogan is going to want to push his rebels forward. Now, whether they can do it, because they're a small force. There's only about 5 million, 5 million people in the rebel territory. So their army can't be that big. And they've got to conquer a whole country. They have to administer Aleppo. Aleppo has no phone service now. It's got no gasoline, no bread. To administer all these new territories is going to suck the energy right out of this rebel onslaught. So building up for a win is going to be very difficult. But we don't know if more wheels will fall off the Assad regime. Already the Druze are talking and asking Druze soldiers to leave the army. The Christians are being hived off. This could fall apart. We just don't know where it stands today. Everybody is looking back and forth, trying to figure out how strong is Assad. Can he rally his troops? And can his allies really support him anymore?
All right, let's talk about his allies. And again, we talked about Russia. Moscow's sole Mediterranean naval base is in Syria. Russia's army saying that it's fired this Tuesday hypersonic missiles during naval and air force drills. It involved 10 ships, 24 aircrafts, but is more muscle flexing, that muscle flexing intended more for Ukraine than to support the regime in Damascus.
Of course, we continue to support Bashar al-Assad, and at the appropriate levels, we continue our contacts, analyse the situation, and a position will be formed on what is needed to stabilise the situation.
And of course, Ariad Hanem, Dmitry Peskov can point to the fact that there have been Russian airstrikes.
Of course.
Nonetheless, when you see naval exercises in Tartus, what's your reading of it?
I feel that the Russian answer actually is very interesting to look at, because...
Are they talking about Syria? Are they talking about Ukraine when they have naval exercises?
That's the point. And you may remember the first reaction of Russia, first pointing out the Syrian responsibility and asking the Syrian regime to get their sovereignty back ASAP. So you don't see here the same kind of very strong support that we had in the previous years, and they had maybe to change, to readjust the narrative a little bit in the following days, saying, of course, we are backing this regime. And they made this symbolic move of changing the commander, the Russian commander, saying that it's his failure if the situation evolved in that way, and replacing by a man who already was in Syria between 2015 and 2017, sending the message that we're sending back the strong men who were able to support the Syrian regime earlier. However, I totally agree on that point, that what's at stake in Syria is, of course, closely linked to what's happening in Ukraine, and that may explain the kind of shift in the position of Russia. First, of course, in terms of interests, maybe leaving the Assad regime a little bit to secure earnings in Ukraine, and also in terms of capabilities, what they are able to do or not. And we know that the Russian military presence in Syria is way weaker today than it was a few years ago.
And there's another precinct that's been heard from on Sunday. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, flying to Damascus to meet Bashar al-Assad, a visit followed up by a verbal show of support from Tehran.
We will do whatever is within our power, offering any assistance necessary to establish security and peace and to combat terrorism.
Samir Aita, Iran's all in, as stated by the president there, or not?
Not clear. Let me make 2 or 3 comments. One, I don't think that Turkey is all responsible of what HTS had made as capacities and for the timing. I think there is something more, some other countries who help HTS. Look at their military equipment, look at the drones. This needs a lot of build-up and a lot of money. But I think as what George said...
So who on top of Turkey? Who on top of Turkey then?
Well, no. Ask the U.S. And imagine link this to the timing, which is the end of the war or the ceasefire in Lebanon. So this is major. But of course, Erdogan jumped at the situation because he will win from that. But he's not. On the Iranian front, there is a problem because the people, even pro-Iranian or the Shia or etc., have a problem of trust in Iran, especially after that Hezbollah major figure, Hassan Nasrallah, was killed.
And they said this week that for now they cannot send people to Syria.
Yes. And that Israel made its war on Hezbollah, the Shia side of South Lebanon and the Bekaa, and etc. And the reaction of Tehran was mild. There was voices in some periods in Lebanon, in the Shia community, why they left us being killed like this, and etc. And I think in the communities who are pro-Iranian in Syria, there will be the same thing, unless Iran goes like what there were some escalation, some declarations today that they will go really and send troops. Last thing about Russia. I heard Mr. Peskov's statement, and I was on Russia Today television yesterday. The impression in Russia, especially after that one guy very close to the political authorities in Russia made an article in Arabic saying that the rebels are not terrorists, saying that what somebody could understand that Bashar al-Assad need to sit with Jolani. This was very surprising, and everybody was commenting this in the community. What does that mean on the Russian attitude and presence today?
Gunnar, your thoughts on this, because the Russians, are they, again, we had that phone call earlier between Erdogan and Putin. The Russians, they're backers of the Syrian Kurds.
Well, from Putin's point of view, he really wants to focus on Ukraine. His military is tired, overstretched, and one of the reasons why HTS was able to capture Aleppo within 48 hours was because Russians are not there as much as they used to on the ground with their military capabilities. So Russians have been bombing from air, but without Wagner directing the attacks on the ground, they are not as effective. And we know that after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, since then Russia has been really decreasing its military presence there. So from Putin's point of view, when he looks at Syria, the ideal scenario for him is if there's some sanctions relief on the regime, Putin can declare this is over. We managed to keep Bashar al-Assad in power, and he is now becoming part of the international community. That is the ideal scenario for Putin. Now, to be able to realize that goal, Putin has been trying to mediate, not just between Turkey and the Assad regime, but also between the Kurds, Syrian Kurds, and the Assad regime. From Putin's point of view, he thinks that the regime can step in to the areas controlled by the Syrian Kurds, and there could be some kind of arrangement. And in that arrangement, maybe the Kurdish military forces could be integrated into the regime's military force. So all those dealings and negotiations have been going on for a long time. But President Assad, he has been dragging his feet, and I think he overplayed his hand. And this is the cost that he has to pay.
And Gönül, your thoughts on when you heard Akhiad earlier saying that the scenario that he envisages is a further fragmentation of Syria, not some kind of compromise. Would you agree?
Well, Putin certainly he wouldn't look. I don't think Putin is looking for an autonomous Kurdish region there. In the ideal scenario, Assad recaptures everything. I think that would be the ideal scenario from Putin's point of view. Whether that's realistic or not, we can discuss that. But I think that's what he wants to see in Syria. And that's why I think the talks have been going on between the Kurds and the regime. And Kurds are, by the way, they are dragging their feet too, saying that they want to keep some kind of autonomy. And the regime is absolutely saying no to that project.
All right, so again, pressure being brought on Bashar al-Assad to compromise, something he's refused to do. Joshua Landis, again, to conclude, you know, we talked how back in 2012, it seemed as though Bashar al-Assad's regime was teetering on the brink. He proved his detractors wrong. Assad's staying power, is it the same today?
It's not. It's not. His army is exhausted, and his enemies have become much smarter. And they're, as Samir said, they've been trained up. They have great weaponry. You look at their uniforms, are much better than Assad's uniforms today. They have walkie-talkies and night gear and all sorts of stuff. That's all coming from Turkey and from foreign backers, because there's nothing in Idlib province that could produce that kind of weaponry. So the ground has changed significantly. And the problem with negotiations here is that you have three different groups that do not like each other and want completely different things. It's a little bit like having the Afghan government that supported America, that America supported, talk with the Taliban, or Israel sit down with Hamas and negotiate a solution. The Assad government sees Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Jolani as terrible enemies. And the rebels, for their part, they want revenge and they want to smash this regime. They don't want to compromise. There's no way that they can sit down together and share power in a common government. Turkey's demands that they sit down and work out some deal, that's pie in the sky. It's not going to happen. The Kurds have greater ability to compromise, but they want their own autonomy. They don't want to go back under the heel of either Damascus or Turkey. And that makes it extremely hard for any of the great powers, whether it's Russia, the United States, or other actors, to bring these three groups to a negotiating table and get some common ground. And that either leads to the fragmentation of Syria, if the Assad regime is not defeated, or I think perhaps to the destruction of the Assad regime and a takeover by Sunni Islamists.
All right, and that begs the question of the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Samir Aita, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Achiad Hanem, Joshua Landis in Norman, Oklahoma, and Gunil Toll in Washington. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.